Hello, and welcome to the Monitor Brief. It's May 31st. I'm Kristen Tolman. Biden has just made a splash announcement laying out a 3-phase ceasefire plan to end the Gaza war. Here's a clip from his speech before we dive into today's episode.
Israel has offered a comprehensive new proposal. It's a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire and the release of all hostages. This proposal has been transmitted by Qatar to Hamas. This is truly a decisive moment. Israel has made their proposal. Hamas says it wants a ceasefire. This deal is an opportunity to prove whether they really mean it. Hamas needs to take the deal. For months, people all over the world have called for a ceasefire. Now it's time to raise your voices and demand that Hamas come to the table, agrees to this deal, and ends this war that they began. At this point, Hamas no longer is capable of carrying out another October 7th, and the Palestinian people have endured sheer hell in this war. Too many innocent people have been killed, including thousands of children. It's time to begin this new stage. For the hostages to come home, for Israel to be secure, for the suffering to stop. It's time for this war to end, and for the day after to begin. Thank you very much.
The proposal that Biden put forward paves the way for a, quote, enduring ceasefire, according to the U.S. president. The onus is now on Hamas to accept it, as Biden says in his Friday speech. Now, on to the main segment. Today's main segment is a conversation with Amber Zaman, Al Monitor's chief correspondent, on her dispatch from Jerusalem, where she looked into a scheme to grab Holy Land in Jerusalem's Armenian quarter. But first, let's get you caught up on the headlines. The UN General Assembly drew criticism Thursday for its tribute to the late Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash, with Washington boycotting the gathering. Yemen's Iran-backed Houthis on Friday threatened to escalate attacks on Red Sea shipping after overnight strikes by the United States and Britain that the rebels said killed 16 people. The Israeli army said Friday its troops pushed into central Rafah, escalating its nearly 8-month war with Hamas, despite international objections over any offensive in the southern Gaza city. For the first time in over a decade, farmers in Syria's rebel-held northwest are irrigating their crops more easily thanks to the rehabilitation of a vital reservoir. Oil giant Saudi Aramco said on Thursday it plans to sell 1.5 billion shares worth of more than $10 billion in one of the biggest such offerings in recent years. And the Middle East economic outlook is caught between low growth and high debt convergence. Now, on to the main segment. Hey, Amberin, welcome to the Al Monitor Brief.
Thanks for having me, Kristen. It's always a pleasure.
So, Amberin, you just got back from a trip to Jerusalem. First, just tell us what the mood was like on the ground.
Well, you know, I went to Jerusalem to cover a very specific story. It's related to this land grab by Jewish settlers. At least that's what people think it's about. But on the face of things, it's about a company owned by an Israeli-Australian businessman buying a very coveted piece of land in the Armenian quarter in East Jerusalem from the Armenian Patriarchate. And in fact, this deal has caused uproar in the Armenian community because they consider this piece of land as almost sacred, and they're just appalled that the Patriarchate, that the Armenian Orthodox Patriarchate did this kind of behind their backs. And as I said, the consensus is that this is just more of Israeli settlers hiding behind businessmen in order to buy more of East Jerusalem. And when I say Israeli settlers, of course, I mean Jewish settlers. I mean Messianic Jews who believe that all of Jerusalem should belong to them. They don't want any non-Jews, and that they also don't want secular Jews. They just want like-minded people living there. And so I went to investigate. And the mood among the community obviously was one of huge anger, but it was also very heartening to see how well organized they are and how they're pushing back to get this deal that was signed in 2021 avoided.
Okay. And so the timeline of it, so it was signed in 2021. When did sort of the details of the deal become known? And then how long have they had to sort of organize and push back against it?
Well, it's a hugely complex story. This deal was apparently signed in 2021, as I said. And then an Armenian publication published a statement by members of the Holy Synod. This is, of course, the priests who are part of the Armenian Patriarchate. Some 12 of them signed a statement saying that, this deal was like wrong and the patriarch had no authority to sign it, that he'd never consulted them. So that's when people first caught wind of what was going on. And it sort of steadily escalated. And you then had more members of the synod sign yet another statement protesting the deal. And eventually, of course, the patriarch had to say something, and he pinned all the blame on this other priest who is in charge, or was rather in charge, of a real estate for the patriarchate. Remember that these churches own a lot of property in Jerusalem. And they therefore have a person who deals with real estate. And so he pinned all the blame on him, said he'd been misled by him. And then things escalated further when Jordan and the Palestinian Authority declared that they no longer recognize the patriarch because he'd acted against the interests of the community, of cultural and historical, as they put it, property in East Jerusalem. And so I think he began to really get nervous. And so finally, he decided to go to court and void the deal and announce that he was pulling out. But very oddly, he refused to share any details of this deal with the community. So in the meantime, it is very complicated. You had the owner of this company basically hire some thugs, and these included Jewish settlers with a history of violence, showing up at this area, which is called the Cow's Garden. It's this open space in East Jerusalem that sits atop Mount Zion, which is the highest point in the city. And it's really quite lovely. It's so peaceful, and there are these birds and beautiful trees, and the air is so cool. There's always a breeze. Anyway, these thugs showed up and sort of tried to take possession of that area. And so in the meantime, the younger people in the community decided it was time to act. So they organized, they call themselves Save the Armenian Quarter, and they sort of set up a kind of a shack, if you will, a container thing in the middle of this plot of land, and began, taking turns to guard the property and to prevent these settlers from moving in. And they had at least 3 quite violent confrontations with them. And they complained that the Israeli police was actually not doing its job properly and was allowing these settlers to hang around. And of course, the owner of the company was among them.
Okay, so it's it is a complicated story. But okay, the location being Cow's Garden, and it's integral to the Armenian community in East Jerusalem, and is being being sold off essentially, and then these sort of young Armenians have created a group to protect that land, and to save it from sort of being sold and out of their possession. how did you first hear about this? I mean, how did you sort of unpack it? And as you were diving into it, was it just seemed like there was piece after piece, or?
Well, first of all, I should note that it's not just this Cow's Garden area, which is also very important for the community because it serves as a parking lot at the same time, and people bring their kids to school in the Armenian quarter. And so they need to park somewhere. And in Jerusalem, it's not the easiest place to park, and least of all the old city. So that's one reason it's also kind of critical for the daily functioning of their lives. Second, this deal also included the patriarch's own garden, his own private parking space, but also a wing of the Armenian seminary where the Armenians hold their annual commemoration of the genocide. So there's, it's very emotional for them. So to your question about how did I hear about this, I saw bits and bobs popping up on Twitter and elsewhere, and I am deeply interested in the Armenians, the Armenian question. I've lived in Armenia. I've traveled there. I've done lots of stories, so it piqued my attention. And then we had some coverage in our monitor, in fact, on this. But I felt that I really needed to go there and find out what was actually going on. And so there is a pattern, as I explained, of Jewish settlers sort of preying on these kinds of properties. And in fact, back in 2005, they signed a similar deal with the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, whereby the Greek Orthodox Patriarch sold two very valuable hotels, which are at the entrance of the Jaffa Gate. That's a very sort of lots of tourists and stuff at like for nothing practically. And that case dragged on for 2 decades, and the Greek Orthodox lost that case in the same way that the Armenian community reacted to that deal, to this deal. Sorry, the Greek Orthodox community, when they heard of it, they also mobilized, but and actually sacked their patriarch, but didn't get very far. But what I found really fascinating in this story was how the Armenian community, which has now taken the patriarchate essentially to court, you are using documents from Ottoman times, a document issued by a Sharia court almost 450 years ago, which actually shows that the property belongs not to the patriarchate, but to the people, and that the patriarch is simply entrusted with managing the property. So I think that's a very crucial piece of evidence. And there is an ironic twist to that, the fact that, the Ottomans somehow are coming to the rescue, even though, of course, in later centuries, the Ottomans were very unkind, to put it very mildly, to the Armenians. But in those days, it was quite intriguing to hear an Armenian historian I spoke to saying that the Ottomans actually, in those days, I underline in those days, treated the Armenian community and other minority communities quite well. And so this land was kind of bequeathed to the Armenian people at that time. And so that's a very vital document which they managed to unearth.
Yeah. My last question really is, if the Armenian community is in East Jerusalem is essentially moving away from the patriarch and saying, we didn't sign off on this. It's quite a small community. Does this leave them vulnerable? I mean, how likely does it seem that their case will win, given that now it sort of feels like them against everyone else?
Well, I mean, they have a lot of support from the Palestinians, for one, because they're all facing the same, problem. So they've managed to mobilize quite a bit of support. They have tremendous support from the Armenian diaspora, which, don't forget, has quite a bit of influence in the Congress. So they're hoping to mobilize Congress members and to get the US government to intervene in some way. But obviously, this is a court case, and courts are meant to be independent. They do have a strong hand, as I mentioned, because of this document. But at the same time, of course, in recent years, Netanyahu and his cohorts have managed to put more and more like-minded judges in the courts, appoint such people who would typically be more sympathetic to the settlers. So obviously, it's too soon to say what the outcome of this case will be, but they are optimistic. They'll keep fighting. They've raised some money to cover their legal fees. Let's see where it goes. But in the meantime, they've shown the world that, they're not just going to roll over. And I must say, I found these Armenian youths to be extremely inspiring.
Wow. Okay. Amber, great reporting, fascinating story. We'll be looking to see what else you write on it to keep up to date.
Thank you, Kristen.
That's it for today, May 31st. You can read all these stories and more impacting the region at allmonitor.com.